Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back 3.2 million years to meet Lucy, the most famous early human ancestor who probably would have preferred to stay in bed. Picture this: you are standing in the scorching heat of what is now Ethiopia, watching a small, hairy figure struggling to walk upright across the African savanna. She is wobbling like a toddler who has had too much apple juice. And frankly, she looks about as thrilled with this whole walking thing as you do when your alarm goes off on Monday morning. The reality is, if you were suddenly transported back to Lucy's time, you'd probably last about as long as a chocolate teapot in the sun. Between the saber-toothed cats, the lack of Wi-Fi, and the complete absence of takeout food, your survival prospects would be grimmer than a tax audit. You are witnessing one of evolution's most reluctant success stories. Lucy belongs to the species Australopithecus afarensis, and she is about to teach you that walking upright wasn't some grand evolutionary leap forward. It was more like being forced to wear uncomfortable shoes for the rest of your life. As you watch her take those hesitant steps, her knees slightly bent, her arms swaying for balance, you realize she is not exactly strutting with confidence. In fact, she looks like she'd rather be doing literally anything else. The morning sun beats down mercilessly as Lucy approaches a small grove of acacia trees. You notice how her gait becomes more stable as she gets closer to potential climbing opportunities. This isn't coincidence, it is strategy. While mainstream science tells us that bipedalism was a revolutionary adaptation that freed our ancestors' hands for tool use and allowed them to see over tall grass, the reality is far more mundane. Lucy and her kind were essentially lazy climbers who got caught between shrinking forests and expanding grasslands. Here is something that might surprise you. Lucy's pelvis shows clear evidence that she spent significant time in trees, with hip joints that were perfectly adapted for both climbing and reluctant ground dwelling. Paleontologists have found that her species retained long curved finger bones, ideal for grasping branches, hardly the hands of committed groundwalkers. But here is where it gets interesting. In that peculiar way that evolution loves to mess with our expectations, researchers have discovered that Australopithecus afarensis actually had a higher metabolic cost for bipedal locomotion than modern humans, meaning every step Lucy took burned more energy than it should have. You follow Lucy as she reaches the trees, and immediately notice how her entire demeanor changes. Gone is the awkward, energy-draining bipedal shuffle. Instead, she flows up the trunk with the grace of a gymnast, her long arms and curved fingers finding purchase on every branch. This is her element, and you can practically feel her relief. Scientists have debated whether Lucy's species was primarily arboreal or terrestrial, but watching her now, the answer seems obvious. She is a tree dweller who occasionally tolerates ground travel when absolutely necessary. The temperature rises as the day progresses, and you observe Lucy making another crucial decision. Rather than continue her ground-based journey, she begins moving through the canopy, traveling from tree to tree with remarkable efficiency. This brachiating locomotion, swinging from branch to branch, uses far less energy than bipedal walking and keeps her safely above ground dwelling predators. Paleontologists still argue about how much time Australopithecus spent in trees versus on the ground, with some suggesting a 50-50 split, while others argue for primarily arboreal lifestyle, with occasional terrestrial forays as afternoon approaches. You notice something fascinating about Lucy's social group. When they do walk on the ground, it is almost always in response to external pressure. A predator sighting, the need to reach a distant food source, or the approach of another Australopithecine group. Their bipedalism isn't driven by preference. It is driven by necessity. And even then, they minimize the time spent walking upright, often dropping to all fours when they think no one's watching, like teenagers slouching when their parents aren't looking. The fossil record reveals that Lucy's brain was only about 1 Third, the size of a modern human's, roughly equivalent to a chimpanzee's. This smaller brain required less energy, but it also meant less sophisticated planning and problem-solving abilities. In other words, Lucy wasn't making calculated decisions about locomotion. She was following the path of least resistance, which usually led back to the trees. Contemporary research suggests that the Australopithecine lifestyle was far more opportunistic than previously thought, with individuals adapting their movement patterns based on immediate environmental pressures rather than long-term strategic planning. You are standing in the afternoon heat, watching Lucy's chest rise and fall as she pauses between steps, and you begin to understand the brutal mathematics of her existence. Every stride she takes on two legs is burning through her limited energy reserves, like a gas-guzzling SUV in city traffic. The numbers are staggering. While modern humans have refined bipedal locomotion to be remarkably efficient, Lucy and her contemporaries were essentially driving the evolutionary equivalent of a 1970s muscle car with a broken fuel gauge. The reality hits you as you calculate the energy expenditure. Lucy's bipedal walking consumes roughly 25% more energy per mile than quadrupedal knuckle walking would. It is like choosing to run everywhere instead of walking, except she has no choice in the matter when crossing open ground. You watch her pause frequently, not out of curiosity or social interaction, but from sheer metabolic necessity. Her body simply can't sustain prolonged bipedal movement without regular rest breaks. What makes this energy crisis even more fascinating is the context of her environment. The East African landscape, 3.2 million years ago, was undergoing dramatic changes, with forests fragmenting and grasslands expanding. Food sources were becoming more scattered, requiring longer journeys between meals. Yet here was Lucy, equipped with the locomotory equivalent of a broken bicycle, trying to cover increasingly vast distances. It is no wonder that paleontologists have found evidence of seasonal stress markers in Australopithecine bones. These creatures were literally wearing themselves out, trying to keep up with their changing world. You notice Lucy's breathing pattern changes as she transitions from walking to climbing. Her respiratory rate drops noticeably once she is secured in the branches of a large fig tree. This isn't just relief from physical exertion, it is metabolic recovery. Tree dwelling allows her to enter what researchers call energy conservation mode, where her heart rate slows and her muscle tension decreases. It is the prehistoric equivalent of collapsing on your couch after a particularly grueling day at work. The fossil evidence reveals something remarkable about Lucy's species. Their bones show adaptations for both climbing and walking. But the climbing adaptations are more pronounced. Their arm-to-leg ratio suggests creatures built primarily for arboreal life, who occasionally ventured to the ground. Mainstream anthropology teaches us that bipedalism was selected for because it offered advantages in tool use and long-distance travel. But the energy costs suggest otherwise. If walking upright was such a great idea, why did it take another 1,000,000 years for our ancestors to become truly efficient at it? Here is where the story gets deliciously ironic. Lucy's inefficient bipedalism may have actually been an evolutionary dead end that accidentally led to success. By forcing her species to develop larger gluteal muscles to stabilize their wobbly gait, they inadvertently created the foundation for the more efficient bipedalism that would eventually emerge in later hominins. It is like accidentally inventing the wheel while trying to make a really round rock. You observe Lucy's feeding behavior and notice another crucial detail. She only walks bipedally when she absolutely has to reach food sources that require ground travel. When possible, she moves arboreally from fruiting tree to fruiting tree, conserving energy for the times when terrestrial locomotion becomes unavoidable. Scientists have debated whether early Australopithecines were primarily frugivorous or had more varied diets. But watching Lucy's selective feeding patterns, it is clear that energy-rich fruits form the cornerstone of her survival strategy. The afternoon sun creates a natural experiment in thermoregulation. As you watch Lucy seek shade, bipedal walking exposes more of her body surface to direct sunlight compared to quadrupedal locomotion, increasing her heat load and water requirements. She instinctively moves toward shaded areas, demonstrating that even her species understood the additional thermal costs of upright walking. This thermal stress adds another layer to the energy equation. Not only does bipedalism cost more calories, but it also increases the risk of dangerous overheating. As evening approaches, you witness something that challenges conventional wisdom about early human social behavior. When Lucy's group encounters another family unit, they don't immediately engage in the territorial displays you might expect. Instead, they seem to be conserving energy, engaging only in minimal social interaction before both groups retreat to separate sleeping trees. Researchers still argue about the social structures of Australopithecus afarensis, with some suggesting complex hierarchies, while others propose more egalitarian arrangements focused on energy conservation. The day's observations crystallize into an uncomfortable truth. Lucy's famous bipedalism wasn't a triumphant march toward humanity. It was a grudging accommodation to environmental pressure. She walks upright, not because it is superior, but because the shrinking forests leave her no choice when traveling between increasingly distant food sources. Every step is a compromise between survival necessity and metabolic efficiency, a biological cost. Benefit analysis played out in real time across the ancient African landscape. You are climbing up into Lucy's favorite fig tree, your hands gripping the same rough bark that her curved fingers have worn smooth over countless seasons. The transition from ground to canopy is immediately transformative, not just for you, but for Lucy and her entire social group. Up here, 30 feet above the African savanna, the harsh realities of bipedal existence simply melt away. The temperature drops several degrees. A gentle breeze carries the sweet scent of ripening figs, and suddenly the energy-draining struggle of upright locomotion becomes irrelevant. Watch Lucy now as she moves through the branches with fluid grace. Her long arms, those same appendages that swing awkwardly when she walks upright, become perfectly calibrated tools for arboreal navigation. She can travel hundreds of yards through the canopy without ever touching the ground, moving from tree to tree with the efficiency of a natural subway system. This is bipedalism's dirty little secret. Our ancestors weren't actually committed to walking upright. They were committed to avoiding it whenever possible. The fig tree serves as Lucy's prehistoric penthouse, complete with room service. These massive trees, some reaching heights of over 100 feet, provided everything an Australopithecus could want: food, water, shelter, and escape routes. The fruits are energy-dense and available year-round, meaning Lucy's group can establish semi-permanent residence in prime fig real estate. You notice how she positions herself strategically on branches that offer multiple exit strategies, classic arboreal behavior, that has nothing to do with ground-based living. Here is where mainstream paleoanthropology gets interesting. While textbooks emphasize the terrestrial adaptations of early hominins, the archaeological evidence tells a different story. Lucy's curved finger bones, her flexible wrists, and her long arms all scream tree, dweller. Her pelvis might be adapted for occasional bipedal locomotion, but her upper body is still firmly committed to the arboreal lifestyle. It is like she is wearing a business suit from the waist down, while keeping her pajamas on top. You observe the social dynamics of tree life, and realize this is where Lucy's species truly thrives. Grooming sessions happen in comfortable positions. Food sharing occurs without the energy costs of ground-based gathering, and predator avoidance becomes effortless. The group's vocalizations change too. The stressed, urgent calls you heard during ground travel are replaced by relaxed social chatter. It is the difference between a tense commute and a lazy Sunday afternoon. The metabolic benefits of arboreal living become clear as you watch Lucy's breathing pattern settle into a restful rhythm. Her heart rate slows, her muscle tension decreases, and she enters what researchers call the arboreal rest state. This isn't just physical relaxation, it is energy conservation on a cellular level. Every minute spent in the trees is a minute her body can dedicate to growth, repair, and reproduction, instead of the exhausting mechanics of bipedal locomotion. But here is the delicious irony that makes Lucy's story so compelling. Her reluctance to embrace ground. Dwelling may have been exactly what drove the evolutionary changes that eventually led to modern humans. By spending most of her time in trees and only reluctantly walking upright when absolutely necessary, she and her species created selective pressure for more efficient bipedalism in future generations. It is evolution by procrastination. The lazy ancestors, who avoided walking as much as possible, inadvertently selected for descendants who could walk more efficiently. The afternoon light filtering through the fig leaves reveals another crucial aspect of Lucy's lifestyle: seasonal flexibility. During fruit abundance, her group can remain arboreal for weeks at a time. But during lean seasons, they're forced to venture onto the ground more frequently, traveling between scattered food sources. Scientists have debated whether this seasonal variation in locomotor behavior was a key driver of human evolution. But watching Lucy's obvious preference for tree-bound living, the answer seems self-evident. You notice Lucy's sleeping preparations as evening approaches. She is constructing what primatologists call a day nest, a temporary platform of woven branches that provides comfort and security. This behavior, shared with modern great apes, reinforces the idea that Lucy's species was fundamentally arboreal in its lifestyle preferences. Paleoanthropologists still argue about whether early hominins built sleeping nests or slept on the ground. But the evidence from Lucy's behavior suggests that comfortable tree sleeping remained the preferred option whenever possible. The fig tree ecosystem reveals itself as Lucy settles in for the night. She is not alone. Dozens of other species use these trees for food and shelter, creating a complex arboreal community. This is Lucy's true habitat, not the open savanna that features so prominently in human evolution documentaries. Her species succeeded not by conquering the ground, but by mastering the art of selective ground use while maintaining their arboreal headquarters. The walking upright part, that was just the occasional grudging concession to a world that was slowly running out of trees. You are standing at the edge of what was once a vast forest, watching as Lucy surveys the expanding grassland before her, with what can only be described as profound reluctance. The landscape tells the story of climate change on a geological timescale, where towering mahogany and fig trees once formed a continuous canopy. Now only scattered groves remain like islands in an ocean of golden grass. Lucy's world is literally shrinking beneath her feet, and she is being forced to adapt to a lifestyle she clearly never wanted. The East African rift system has been slowly tearing the continent apart for millions of years, creating the dramatic geographical changes that shaped early human evolution. As the rift deepened and widened, it altered regional weather patterns, gradually transforming lush woodlands into the mosaic landscape of forests and grasslands that Lucy now calls home. But calling it home might be generous. Watching her hesitate at the forest edge, she looks more like a reluctant tourist than a confident resident. You observe Lucy's group as they face their daily dilemma: remain in the safety and comfort of their dwindling forest patch, or venture across the intimidating expanse of open grassland to reach the next cluster of trees. The decision-making process is fascinating to watch. They don't charge boldly into the unknown like pioneering explorers. Instead, they engage in what researchers call edge behavior, spending considerable time at the forest boundary, testing their courage against their hunger. The fossil record shows that Australopithecus afarensis lived during a period of significant environmental transition, roughly 3.9 to 2.9 million years ago. This coincides perfectly with major climate shifts that saw average temperatures drop and rainfall become more seasonal. Lucy wasn't adapting to stable conditions. She was caught in the middle of one of Africa's most dramatic environmental transformations. It is like being forced to learn to swim while the pool is being drained around you. Here is where the story gets particularly poignant. Lucy's species didn't choose this transition. They were victims of circumstance, pushed out of their preferred habitat by forces completely beyond their control. You watch as she finally takes those first tentative steps onto the grassland, her posture screaming discomfort with every stride. Her head swivels constantly, scanning for predators that could approach unseen through the tall grass. This isn't confident exploration, this is anxious survival. The energy mathematics become even more brutal in this transitional landscape. Not only does Lucy have to expend extra calories walking bipedally across open ground, but she also has to remain hypervigilant for threats. Stress hormones flood her system, increasing her metabolic rate even further. It is like trying to run a marathon while constantly looking over your shoulder for approaching danger. The physiological cost of this lifestyle would have been enormous. You notice something crucial about Lucy's route selection. She doesn't take straight lines across the grassland. Instead, she follows a zigzag pattern that keeps her as close as possible to scattered trees and large rocks. Anything that might offer climbing opportunities or shelter. Paleontologists have debated whether early hominins were strategic route planners or simply opportunistic travelers. But Lucy's cautious navigation suggests a keen awareness of the risks inherent in open ground travel. The social dynamics of the group change dramatically once they leave the forest edge. The relaxed chatter you observed in the trees gives way to efficient, low-volume communication. Hand signals become more common than vocalizations. Everyone moves in a loose formation that maximizes their collective ability to spot threats, while minimizing the distance any individual would need to cover to reach safety. This isn't learned behavior. It is the kind of instinctive caution that develops when your survival depends on not attracting unwanted attention. Climate data from this period reveals that rainfall was becoming increasingly unpredictable, with longer dry seasons and more intense wet periods. The reliable year-round fruiting cycles that Lucy's ancestors had depended upon were breaking down, forcing more frequent and longer journeys between food sources. Scientists still argue about whether climate change was the primary driver of human evolution or simply one factor among many. But watching Lucy's obvious distress at leaving her arboreal comfort zone, the environmental pressure seems undeniable. As the day progresses, you witness Lucy's group developing what might be called grudging efficiency in their terrestrial travel. They're getting better at bipedal locomotion, not because they enjoy it, but because the alternative, staying in shrinking forest fragments and slowly starving, is even worse. Evolution doesn't always reward the bold or the innovative. Sometimes it simply weeds out those who are too inflexible to adapt to changing circumstances, even when that adaptation feels like a step backward rather than progress. You are watching Lucy's group encounter another family unit near a watering hole, and the social theatre that unfolds reveals something unexpected about early hominin behavior. Instead of the cooperative sharing you might expect from our human ancestors, what you witness looks more like a prehistoric popularity contest. Lucy straightens her posture, puffs out her chest slightly, and begins what can only be described as a bipedal swagger. This isn't about efficient locomotion. This is about looking good while doing it. The males in both groups are particularly dramatic in their displays. They walk with exaggerated upright postures, their arms swinging in deliberate arcs, their chests thrust forward in poses that would make a bodybuilder proud. But here is the fascinating part. The moment they think no one is watching, they immediately relax into more comfortable, energy-efficient postures. It is like watching teenagers at a school dance, all performed confidence on the surface, genuine awkwardness underneath. Modern primatology has revealed that many species engage in locomotor displays during social encounters, but Lucy's group takes this to an almost comical extent. The females evaluate potential mates not just on size or strength, but on their ability to maintain impressive bipedal postures during extended social interactions. Scientists have debated whether sexual selection played a role in the evolution of human bipedalism and watching these social dynamics. The answer seems obvious. Walking upright wasn't just about survival, it was about looking attractive while surviving. You notice that younger individuals in the group are less concerned with bipedal showmanship and more focused on practical matters, like finding food and staying close to protective adults. But adolescent males are absolutely obsessed with their walking performance, practicing their struts even when no females are present. It is prehistoric peacocking, and the energy costs are enormous. These young males are literally burning calories to impress potential mates, turning basic locomotion into an exhausting. The social hierarchy becomes clear as you observe who gets to walk where. Dominant individuals take the most stable, energy-efficient routes across uneven terrain, while subordinate group members are relegated to more challenging paths that require greater bipedal skill and endurance. This creates a feedback loop. Those who can afford the energy costs of impressive bipedal locomotion gain social status, which gives them access to better resources, which allows them to maintain their energy-expensive walking displays. Here is where the story gets deliciously ironic. The individuals who are best at walking upright, dominant males and females, secure the choicest territories near reliable food and water sources, minimizing their actual travel requirements. Meanwhile, subordinate individuals are forced to cover greater distances in search of resources, but they're also the ones least able to afford the energy costs of impressive bipedal displays. It is a prehistoric catch-22 that would make any economist weep. The mating implications become even more intriguing when you consider the seasonal nature of these displays. During times of food abundance, when energy is readily available, bipedal showing off reaches almost absurd levels. Males engage in what researchers call locomotor competitions, essentially seeing who can maintain the most impressive upright posture for the longest period. But during lean seasons, these same individuals abandon their bipedal vanity projects in favor of practical, energy-conserving movement patterns. You observe Lucy herself participating in this social theatre, though her approach is more subtle than the male's dramatic displays. She maintains excellent posture during group interactions, but conserves her energy by choosing her moments carefully. When she does walk bipedally in social situations, her movements are fluid and confident, suggesting years of practice at making this difficult locomotion look effortless. Paleoanthropologists still argue about whether females played an active role in sexual selection among early hominins, but Lucy's strategic use of bipedal display suggests sophisticated social calculation. The most fascinating aspect of these social interactions is their temporary nature. Once the groups separate and move away from the watering hole, the elaborate bipedal performances immediately cease. Lucy's group returns to their normal pattern of minimal ground travel and maximum tree time, as if the entire display had been an exhausting but necessary social obligation. It is like watching people change from formal business attire into comfortable pajamas the moment they get home from work. This behavioral pattern reveals something profound about the evolution of human bipedalism. It may have originated not as a practical adaptation for terrestrial living, but as a social signal that accidentally became useful for other purposes. Lucy and her contemporaries were essentially trapped in an evolutionary arms race of locomotor display, forced to become better at walking upright, not because it was inherently beneficial, but because their social success depended on it. The practical advantages of bipedalism, tool use, long-distance travel, improved predator detection, may have been fortunate side effects of what began as prehistoric social media performance. The social dynamics of the group change dramatically once they leave the forest edge. The relaxed chatter you observed in the trees gives way to efficient, low-volume communication. Hand signals become more common than vocalizations. Everyone moves in a loose formation that maximizes their collective ability to spot threats, while minimizing the distance any individual would need to cover to reach safety. This isn't learned behavior. It is the kind of instinctive caution that develops when your survival depends on not attracting unwanted attention. Climate data from this period reveals that rainfall was becoming increasingly unpredictable, with longer dry seasons and more intense wet periods. The reliable year-round fruiting cycles that Lucy's ancestors had depended upon were breaking down, forcing more frequent and longer journeys between food sources. Scientists still argue about whether climate change was the primary driver of human evolution, or simply one factor among many. But watching Lucy's obvious distress at leaving her arboreal comfort zone, the environmental pressure seems undeniable. As the day progresses, you witness Lucy's group developing what might be called grudging efficiency in their terrestrial travel. They're getting better at bipedal locomotion, not because they enjoy it, but because the alternative, staying in shrinking forest fragments and slowly starving, is even worse. Evolution doesn't always reward the bold or the innovative. Sometimes it simply weeds out those who are too inflexible to adapt to changing circumstances, even when that adaptation feels like a step backward rather than progress. You are following Lucy's group as they embark on their daily food quest. And what unfolds is a masterclass in strategic laziness. These aren't the determined hunter, gatherers of popular imagination. They're more like prehistoric couch potatoes who occasionally venture out for snacks. Lucy approaches a low-hanging fruit cluster and performs the most half-hearted bipedal reach you've ever witnessed, her posture suggesting she'd rather be doing literally anything else. The foraging strategy of Australopithecus afarensis reveals itself as a careful cost-benefit analysis played out in real time. Lucy's group has mentally catalogued every food source within a reasonable distance of their home trees, ranking them not by nutritional value, but by the amount of walking required to reach them. The juiciest, most energy-rich fruits that require extensive ground travel often remain unharvested, while less appealing options that can be reached with minimal bipedal effort are thoroughly exploited. You observe Lucy discovering a fallen branch loaded with overripe figs about 50 yards away across open grassland. The internal struggle is written across her face as she weighs the energy cost of the journey against the caloric reward of the fruit. She takes a few tentative steps, stops, looks back toward the trees, takes a few more steps, then ultimately abandons the mission entirely. It is prehistoric procrastination at its finest. Why walk 50 yards today when you might find something equally good 5 yards away tomorrow? This behavioral pattern has profound implications for our understanding of early human subsistence strategies. While anthropologists have traditionally emphasized the importance of hunting and gathering in human evolution, Lucy's group demonstrates a third category: strategic non-gathering. They're actively choosing not to exploit available resources when the locomotor costs exceed their energy budgets. It is evolutionary economics in action, and the math clearly favors staying put whenever possible. The group's foraging efficiency improves dramatically when they can avoid ground travel entirely. Moving through connected tree canopies, they can harvest fruits from multiple species without ever touching the earth below. You watch Lucy swing effortlessly from a fig tree to an acacia, then to a wild olive, collecting food with minimal energy expenditure. This arboreal foraging network represents the true lifestyle preference of her species. Terrestrial food gathering is clearly a backup plan, not a primary strategy. What is particularly fascinating is how the group handles seasonal variations in food availability. During abundant periods, they become even more selective about which terrestrial resources are worth pursuing. Why walk across dangerous open ground for mediocre tubers when the trees are loaded with high-quality fruits? But during lean times, you observe a grudging expansion of their foraging radius, with obvious reluctance and frequent rest stops. Scientists have debated whether seasonal food stress was a major driver of bipedal evolution, and watching Lucy's group's seasonal behavior changes, the connection seems undeniable. The tool use implications of this lazy foraging strategy are equally revealing. Lucy occasionally picks up sticks to knock fruits from high branches, but she abandons these tools immediately after use, rather than carrying them during bipedal travel. The energy cost of tool transport apparently outweighs the potential benefits, at least in her ecological niche. This suggests that the famous association between bipedalism and tool use may have been more complex than traditionally assumed. Perhaps early hominins became better tool users, not because walking upright freed their hands, but because they were too lazy to walk far enough to find better food sources. You notice that Lucy's foraging decisions are heavily influenced by the proximity of escape routes. She'll venture farther from trees to reach food sources that are near rocky outcrops or large termite mounds, anything that might provide climbing opportunities if predators appear. This risk management approach to foraging reveals sophisticated spatial awareness and planning abilities, but it also emphasizes how every terrestrial foraging decision is viewed through the lens of personal safety rather than nutritional optimization. The social aspects of this foraging laziness create interesting group dynamics. Individuals who are willing to undertake longer terrestrial journeys for food often share their discoveries with those who stayed behind, creating a social safety net that enables even the most committed tree dwellers to survive. Paleoanthropologists continue to debate the extent of food sharing among early hominins, but Lucy's group demonstrates clear evidence of cooperative resource distribution that compensates for individual variation in foraging motivation. As evening approaches and Lucy's group settles into their sleeping trees, you realize you've witnessed something profound, an evolutionary strategy based, not on conquering new environments, but on doing the absolute minimum necessary to survive in changing conditions. Their approach to terrestrial foraging isn't about embracing ground-dwelling life. It is about maintaining their preferred arboreal lifestyle with the smallest possible concessions to environmental reality. You are crouched in the tall grass beside Lucy, your heart pounding as the distinctive growl of a saber-toothed cat echoes across the savanna. This is the moment when all of Lucy's reluctant bipedal training pays unexpected dividends, though not in the way you might expect. Instead of standing tall to spot the predator or running upright to escape, she does something far more pragmatic. She immediately scans the horizon for the nearest climbable object while maintaining a low, energy-efficient crouch. The predator-prey dynamics of Lucy's world reveal the true complexity of early hominin survival strategies. That magnificent saber-toothed cat stalking through the grassland isn't just a threat. It is a living reminder of why Lucy's species developed such a conflicted relationship with terrestrial locomotion. Every step taken upright on open ground is a calculated risk. A brief exposure to creatures that are faster, stronger, and far better adapted to savanna hunting than any early hominin could ever hope to be. You watch Lucy's escape strategy unfold with surprising sophistication. Rather than panicking into a clumsy bipedal sprint, she moves in a low, efficient crouch toward a cluster of rocky outcrops about 30 yards away. Her movement pattern is revealing. She is not trying to outrun the predator through superior bipedal locomotion. Instead, she is buying time to reach climbing opportunities where her arboreal skills will give her the advantage. It is like watching someone run toward a fire escape, rather than trying to outrun the fire itself. The fossil record shows evidence of predation on early hominins, including tooth marks on Australopithecine bones that match the dental patterns of large cats. Lucy's species lived in constant awareness of this threat, and their behavioral adaptations reflect this reality. Bipedal locomotion wasn't primarily about efficient ground travel. It was about maximizing your options when things went horribly wrong. Standing upright allows better predator detection, but more importantly, it keeps you ready to sprint toward the nearest escape route. Here is where the story gets particularly interesting from a biomechanical perspective. Lucy's group has developed what researchers call flexible escape locomotion. They can transition seamlessly between different movement patterns depending on the threat level and available escape routes. Low-profile quadrupedal movement for stealth, bipedal running for open ground sprints, and rapid climbing transitions when vertical escape becomes possible. It is like having multiple gears in a transmission, each optimized for specific survival scenarios. You observe the group's communication system during this predator encounter, and it is remarkably sophisticated. Silent hand signals indicate threat direction and intensity, while subtle body positioning communicates escape route preferences. There is no panic, no dramatic pointing or shouting, just efficient information, sharing that minimizes the risk of attracting additional predatory attention. Scientists have debated whether early hominins had complex communication systems, but watching this coordinated threat response, their social intelligence is undeniable. The saber-toothed cat eventually moves on, apparently unaware of Lucy's group, and you witness the immediate behavioral shift that follows. The tense alertness gives way to obvious relief, but not to careless relaxation. Instead, the group engages in what appears to be a post-threat assessment, examining the terrain for additional escape routes and alternative travel paths that might reduce future exposure to similar dangers. This isn't instinctive behavior. It is learned risk management that suggests considerable cognitive sophistication. Lucy's individual response to the predator encounter reveals something profound about the relationship between bipedalism and survival psychology. The stress of terrestrial exposure has clearly shaped her species' entire approach to ground-based locomotion. Every bipedal step is taken with predator awareness. Every route selection considers escape options, and every moment spent away from climbing opportunities is mentally catalogued as increased risk. Paleoanthropologists continue to argue about whether predation pressure was a major factor in human evolution. But Lucy's obvious anxiety during ground travel suggests it was certainly a major factor in daily survival decisions. As the group resumes their journey, you notice they've modified their travel pattern based on the predator encounter. They're now moving in a more compact formation, with individuals taking turns as lookouts, while others focus on efficient locomotion. The energy costs of this enhanced vigilance are significant, but the alternative, becoming someone else's dinner, makes the metabolic investment worthwhile. It is another example of how bipedalism in Lucy's world isn't about optimization, but about acceptable compromises between competing survival pressures. The afternoon's events crystallize into a crucial insight. Lucy's species didn't master bipedal locomotion through confident practice and gradual improvement. They developed it through repeated exposure to life, threatening situations that demanded flexible, multi-modal movement capabilities. Their walking skills were forged not in the comfort of safe practice areas, but in the terrifying reality of a landscape filled with creatures that viewed early hominins as convenient snack foods. You are walking alongside Lucy's group as they begin their seasonal migration, and the reluctance is palpable. This isn't the purposeful journey of determined nomads. It is more like watching a family of teenagers being dragged on a camping trip they never wanted to take. Lucy keeps looking back toward their abandoned grove of trees, with the kind of longing usually reserved for lost loves or forgotten lunches. The reality of seasonal migration for Australopithecus afarensis reveals itself as a grudging necessity rather than an evolutionary strategy. The timing of this migration coincides with the dry season, when their preferred fruit trees stop producing and water sources begin to dwindle. You observe the group's decision-making process, which involves considerably more hesitation and false starts than you might expect from seasoned travelers. They'll walk a few hundred yards, then stop and debate whether to continue or return to familiar territory. It is prehistoric second, guessing on a massive scale, and the energy costs of all this indecision are enormous. Lucy's approach to long-distance bipedal travel reveals the true nature of her species' relationship with terrestrial locomotion. She walks in short bursts, followed by extended rest periods, not because she is pacing herself strategically, but because sustained bipedal movement is genuinely exhausting for her anatomy. Her gait becomes increasingly inefficient as fatigue sets in, her knee joints wobbling, and her stride shortening with each mile. This isn't the confident striding of a species that has mastered ground-based locomotion. It is the determined slog of creatures doing what they must to survive. The group's migration route tells a fascinating story about early hominin geography and risk assessment. Rather than taking direct paths between seasonal territories, they follow meandering routes that connect scattered groves and rock formations. Every segment of their journey is planned around available climbing opportunities, turning what could be a 2-day direct march into a week-long series of short hops between safe zones. Scientists have debated whether early hominins were efficient long-distance travelers, but Lucy's group demonstrates that their version of migration was more like an extended series of camping trips with reluctant participants. You notice how the social dynamics of the group change during migration. The usual relaxed interactions give way to a kind of collective grumpiness that would be familiar to anyone who has ever been stuck in traffic with cranky family members. Disputes over rest stops become more frequent, food sharing becomes more grudging, and everyone seems generally irritated with the entire enterprise. This isn't the cooperative, forward-thinking behavior, often attributed to early humans. It is the natural response of creatures being forced to do something they find inherently unpleasant. The energy mathematics of migration reveal why Lucy's group finds long-distance travel so challenging. While modern humans can walk efficiently for hours, covering 20 or 30 miles in a day, Lucy's group struggles to manage even 5 miles before requiring extended recovery periods. Their bipedal locomotion burns roughly 40% more energy per mile than modern human walking, and they lack the physiological adaptations for sustained terrestrial travel. It is like trying to run a marathon in high heels, technically possible, but nobody's idea of a good time. Here is where the story gets particularly revealing about the nature of early hominin adaptation. Lucy's group has developed elaborate strategies for minimizing the amount of actual walking required during migration. They've identified seasonal water sources that allow for longer stays in single locations, reducing the need for frequent moves. They've learned to cache non-perishable foods along migration routes, creating supply depots that reduce foraging requirements during travel days. Most importantly, they've developed flexible timing strategies that allow them to delay migration until absolutely necessary. The migration also reveals the sophisticated spatial memory capabilities of Lucy's species. Despite their obvious reluctance to travel, they navigate between seasonal territories with remarkable accuracy, suggesting detailed mental maps of landscape features, resource locations, and safe camping sites. Paleoanthropologists continue to debate the cognitive abilities of early hominins, but watching Lucy's group successfully navigate complex migration routes, while simultaneously complaining about the entire enterprise, suggests considerable intelligence applied to making the best of an unpleasant situation. As evening approaches and the group settles into a temporary campsite, you observe their remarkable ability to quickly identify and exploit local climbing opportunities. Within minutes of arriving at a new location, they've assessed every tree, rock formation, and elevated feature for defensive potential. This rapid environmental assessment suggests that their migration strategies are fundamentally about connecting safe arboreal zones rather than embracing terrestrial living. They're not becoming ground dwellers, they're reluctantly traveling between tree-dwelling opportunities. The day's journey ends with Lucy's group having covered perhaps 3 miles of actual distance, while expending enough energy to have walked twice that far efficiently. Their migration represents one of evolution's most reluctant success stories. A species that survived environmental challenges not by enthusiastically adapting to new lifestyles, but by doing just enough adaptation to maintain their preferred way of life under increasingly difficult circumstances. You are walking alongside Lucy's group as they begin their seasonal migration, and the reluctance is palpable. This isn't the purposeful journey of determined nomads. It is more like watching a family of teenagers being dragged on a camping trip they never wanted to take. Lucy keeps looking back toward their abandoned grove of trees, with the kind of longing usually reserved for lost loves or forgotten lunches. The reality of seasonal migration for Australopithecus afarensis reveals itself as a grudging necessity rather than an evolutionary strategy. The timing of this migration coincides with the dry season, when their preferred fruit trees stop producing and water sources begin to dwindle. You observe the group's decision-making process, which involves considerably more hesitation and false starts than you might expect from seasoned travelers. They'll walk a few hundred yards, then stop and debate whether to continue or return to familiar territory. It is prehistoric second, guessing on a massive scale, and the energy costs of all this indecision are enormous. Lucy's approach to long-distance bipedal travel reveals the true nature of her species' relationship, which she walks in short bursts, followed by extended rest periods, not because she is pacing herself strategically, but because sustained bipedal movement is genuinely exhausting for her anatomy. Her gait becomes increasingly inefficient as fatigue sets in, her knee joints wobbling and her stride shortening with each mile. This isn't the confident striding of a species that has mastered ground-based locomotion. It is the determined slog of creatures doing what they must to survive. The group's migration route tells a fascinating story about early hominin geography and risk assessment. Rather than taking direct paths between seasonal territories, they follow meandering routes that connect scattered groves and rock formations. Every segment of their journey is planned around available climbing opportunities, turning what could be a 2-day direct march into a week-long series of short hops between safe zones. Scientists have debated whether early hominins were efficient long-distance travelers, but Lucy's group demonstrates that their version of migration was more like an extended series of camping trips with reluctant participants. You notice how the social dynamics of the group change during migration. The usual relaxed interactions give way to a kind of collective grumpiness that would be familiar to anyone who has ever been stuck in traffic with cranky family members. Disputes over rest stops become more frequent. Food sharing becomes more grudging, and everyone seems generally irritated with the entire enterprise. This isn't the cooperative, forward-thinking behavior often attributed to early humans. It is the natural response of creatures being forced to do something they find inherently unpleasant. The energy mathematics of migration reveal why Lucy's group finds long-distance travel so challenging. While modern humans can walk efficiently for hours, covering 20 or 30 miles in a day, Lucy's group struggles to manage even 5 miles before requiring extended recovery periods. Their bipedal locomotion burns roughly 40% more energy per mile than modern human walking, and they lack the physiological adaptations for sustained terrestrial travel. It is like trying to run a marathon in high heels, technically possible, but nobody's idea of a good time. Here is where the story gets particularly revealing about the nature of early hominin adaptation. Lucy's group has developed elaborate strategies for minimizing the amount of actual walking required during migration. They've identified seasonal water sources that allow for longer stays in single locations, reducing the need for frequent moves. They've learned to cache non-perishable foods along migration routes, creating supply depots that reduce foraging requirements during travel days. Most importantly, they've developed flexible timing strategies that allow them to delay migration until absolutely necessary. The migration also reveals the sophisticated spatial memory capabilities of Lucy's species. Despite their obvious reluctance to travel, they navigate between seasonal territories with remarkable accuracy, suggesting detailed mental maps of landscape features, resource locations, and safe camping sites. Paleoanthropologists continue to debate the cognitive abilities of early hominins, but watching Lucy's group successfully navigate complex migration routes while simultaneously complaining about the entire enterprise suggests considerable intelligence applied to making the best of an unpleasant situation. As evening approaches and the group settles into a temporary campsite, you observe their remarkable ability to quickly identify and exploit local climbing opportunities. Within minutes of arriving at a new location, they've assessed every tree, rock formation, and elevated feature for defensive potential. This rapid environmental assessment suggests that their migration strategies are fundamentally about connecting safe arboreal zones rather than embracing terrestrial living. They're not becoming ground dwellers. They're reluctantly traveling between tree-dwelling opportunities. The day's journey ends with Lucy's group having covered perhaps 3 miles of actual distance, while expending enough energy to have walked twice that far efficiently. Their migration represents one of evolution's most reluctant success stories. A species that survived environmental challenges not by enthusiastically adapting to new lifestyles, but by doing just enough adaptation to maintain their preferred way of life under increasingly difficult circumstances. You are crouched beside Lucy as she examines her newborn infant, and the harsh realities of prehistoric parenting immediately become apparent. That tiny skull cradled in her arms represents both Lucy's genetic future and her metabolic nightmare. Early hominin babies were born with relatively large brains compared to their body size, but this neurological advantage came with a crushing energy cost that would reshape Lucy's entire approach to bipedal locomotion. Carrying a baby while walking upright isn't just challenging, it is a biomechanical disaster waiting to happen. The fossil record shows that Australopithecus afarensis had brain volumes roughly 35% larger than modern chimpanzees, but still only about 1/3 the size of modern human brains. This might seem like a modest increase, but the metabolic implications were enormous. Brain tissue consumes approximately 20% of the body's total energy budget, and Lucy's slightly larger brain meant she was already operating on tighter energy margins than her more distant ancestors. Adding the caloric demands of pregnancy, birth, and infant care to her already inefficient bipedal lifestyle created a perfect storm of energy scarcity. You observe Lucy attempting to walk while carrying her infant, and the biomechanical challenges are immediately obvious. Her center of gravity shifts dramatically with the added weight, forcing her to adopt an even more energy-expensive walking posture. Her stride shortens, her balance becomes precarious, and her overall locomotor efficiency plummets to levels that would make her normal walking look graceful by comparison. It is like watching someone try to navigate an obstacle course while carrying a fragile, squirming package that occasionally screams for attention. The brain development timeline reveals another crucial factor in Lucy's energy calculations. Unlike modern human babies, who are born with relatively underdeveloped brains that continue growing rapidly after birth, Lucy's infant arrives with a brain that is already approaching its adult proportions. This means she has been supporting enhanced brain development throughout her pregnancy, drawing heavily on her limited energy reserves during the most crucial phases of fetal neurological growth. The metabolic costs of this enlarged brain development may explain why Lucy's species remained relatively small in overall body size. They simply couldn't afford to be both brainy and bulky. Here is where the evolutionary trade-offs become particularly interesting. Lucy's enlarged brain gives her enhanced problem-solving abilities, but it also makes physical activities like bipedal locomotion more challenging. Brain tissue requires a constant supply of glucose and oxygen, and the stress of walking upright while carrying an infant creates competing demands on her cardiovascular and metabolic systems. You watch her make frequent stops during even short journeys, not from laziness but from genuine physiological necessity. The social implications of brain enlargement become apparent as you observe Lucy's group dynamics during infant care periods. Mothers with young babies receive preferential access to high-energy foods and are allowed to contribute less to group foraging activities. This cooperative child rearing strategy suggests that the energy costs of enlarged brain development were so significant that they required community-level adaptations to ensure survival. Scientists have debated whether cooperative breeding was a cause or consequence of brain enlargement in early hominins, but Lucy's group demonstrates clear evidence of social support systems designed to offset maternal energy deficits. The carrying strategies Lucy develops reveal sophisticated biomechanical problem solving despite her obviously limited locomotor options. She alternates between different carrying positions, sometimes cradling the infant against her chest, other times carrying it on her hip or back, apparently trying to find configurations that minimize the impact on her walking efficiency. But none of these positions provide satisfactory solutions to the fundamental problem. Bipedal locomotion is difficult enough without the added complications of infant transport. You notice that Lucy's infant shows remarkably advanced gripping abilities, with strong hands that can maintain secure holds on its mother's fur during movement. This enhanced infant gripping capability suggests evolutionary pressure for babies who could reduce the energy costs of being carried by contributing to their own transport security. Paleoanthropologists continue to argue about the developmental timelines of early hominin infants, but Lucy's baby demonstrates motor skills that seem specifically adapted to the challenges of being carried by a reluctantly bipedal mother. The brain size increase also affects Lucy's decision-making during daily activities. She shows enhanced ability to plan routes that minimize energy expenditure while maximizing safety for her vulnerable infant. Her route selection becomes more sophisticated, her risk assessment more nuanced, and her tool use more purposeful. But all of this enhanced cognitive ability comes at the cost of increased metabolic demands, creating a feedback loop where being smarter requires more energy. But energy acquisition becomes more challenging when you are responsible for a dependent infant. As evening approaches and Lucy settles into her sleeping nest with her baby, you realize you are witnessing one of evolution's most expensive experiments. The enlarged brains that would eventually enable human civilization were, in Lucy's time, primarily a metabolic burden that made an already challenging lifestyle even more difficult. The cognitive advantages were real but subtle, while the energy costs were immediate and severe. It is a reminder that evolutionary progress often looks more like an expensive gamble than an obvious improvement. You are standing on the edge of the Great Rift Valley as it slowly tears itself apart, witnessing geological forces that make Lucy's personal struggles with bipedalism seem almost trivial by comparison. The earth beneath your feet is literally splitting in two, creating the dramatic topographical changes that will reshape not just the landscape, but the entire trajectory of early hominin evolution. Lucy's species didn't choose to live during one of Africa's most dramatic geological transformations. They were simply unlucky enough to be caught in the middle of continental-scale Earth moving. The rift system extends for thousands of miles, from the Red Sea in the north to Mozambique in the south, and its formation has been ongoing for roughly 25 million years. But the period during which Lucy lived saw particularly intense activity, with new fault lines opening, volcanic activity increasing, and dramatic changes in elevation, creating entirely new weather patterns. You can feel the ground trembling beneath your feet as tectonic forces continue their relentless work, and you begin to understand why Lucy's ancestors were forced to abandon their comfortable arboreal lifestyle. The geological record shows that rift formation created a rain-shadow effect, that dramatically reduced precipitation on the eastern side of the valley. What had been lush, continuous forests gradually gave way to the mosaic landscape of scattered woodlands and expanding grasslands that characterized Lucy's world. But this wasn't a gradual, comfortable transition that allowed species to adapt slowly over millions of years. It was geological violence that transformed entire ecosystems within relatively brief timeframes. You observe how the changing topography affected Lucy's daily movement patterns. The Rift Valley created natural corridors and barriers that channeled hominin populations along specific routes, forcing them into closer contact with new environments and other species. River courses shifted as the land tilted and warped, creating new water sources in some areas, while eliminating them in others. Lucy's group had to constantly adapt their territorial boundaries and migration routes to accommodate these ongoing geological changes, adding yet another layer of challenge to their already difficult lifestyle. Here is where the story becomes particularly compelling from an evolutionary perspective. The geological stress may have accelerated the selective pressures that favored more efficient bipedal locomotion. As traditional forest habitats fragmented and disappeared, early hominins who could cover greater distances between remaining woodland patches would have had significant survival advantages. The Rift Valley wasn't just changing the landscape, it was actively selecting for individuals who could tolerate more terrestrial travel, even if they didn't particularly enjoy it. The volcanic activity associated with rift formation created additional challenges and opportunities for Lucy's species. Periodic ash falls could devastate local vegetation, forcing temporary migrations to unaffected areas. But volcanic soils also created pockets of exceptional fertility that supported particularly rich forest resources. You watch Lucy's group navigate around a recent lava flow, their route selection showing intimate knowledge of how geological events affect local resource availability. Scientists have debated whether volcanic activity was a major factor in early hominin evolution, but the evidence from the Rift Valley suggests it was impossible to ignore. The fossil preservation conditions created by Rift Valley geology provide us with remarkable insights into Lucy's world, but they also reveal the violent nature of her environment. Many Australopithecine fossils show evidence of rapid burial by volcanic ash or flood sediments, suggesting that sudden geological events were a regular feature of daily life. Lucy's species lived in constant awareness that the landscape itself was unreliable, subject to dramatic changes that could eliminate familiar territories and resources with little warning. You notice how Lucy's group has developed behavioral adaptations to geological instability that go beyond simple locomotor changes. They maintain mental maps of alternative routes and backup territories, constantly updating their knowledge of safe passageways and resource locations as the landscape shifts around them. This cognitive flexibility in response to environmental change may have been one of the key factors that enabled their survival during such a geologically active period. The elevation changes created by rift formation also affected local climate conditions, creating microclimates that could vary dramatically over relatively small distances. Lucy's group shows sophisticated understanding of these climatic variations, timing their movements to take advantage of seasonal weather patterns that are influenced by the complex topography of the Rift Valley. Paleoanthropologists continue to argue about how well early hominins understood their local environments. But Lucy's group demonstrates detailed knowledge of how geological features influence everything from water availability to predator behavior. As you follow Lucy through this geologically dynamic landscape, you realize that her reluctant bipedalism may have been as much a response to unstable terrain as to changing vegetation patterns. Walking upright provides better balance and stability on uneven ground, and the Rift Valley's constantly shifting topography would have created numerous situations where bipedal locomotion offered advantages over quadrupedal movement. The geological forces that were tearing Africa apart weren't just changing the scenery. They were actively shaping the evolutionary trajectory that would eventually lead to modern humans. You are observing Lucy during what researchers call the mating season social circus, and the energy expenditures involved make her normal bipedal struggles look economical by comparison. The males in her group have transformed into prehistoric performers, strutting with exaggerated upright gaits that would exhaust a marathon runner. But here is the fascinating part. The females aren't just passive observers of this locomotor theatre. They're active participants in a complex selection process that is quietly reshaping the future of human evolution. Lucy herself demonstrates surprisingly sophisticated mate evaluation criteria as she watches the males compete. She is not simply impressed by the biggest or strongest individuals. Instead, she pays careful attention to which males can maintain impressive bipedal displays for extended periods without obvious fatigue. This endurance-based selection creates evolutionary pressure for more efficient upright locomotion, even though the individuals being selected don't necessarily enjoy walking any more than their less athletic competitors. The courtship displays reveal something profound about the relationship between sexual selection and locomotor evolution. Males, who can afford the enormous energy costs of prolonged bipedal showing, are advertising their access to high-quality resources and their overall fitness. It is prehistoric conspicuous consumption, where the ability to waste energy on impressive walking becomes a signal of genetic quality. Scientists have debated whether sexual selection played a significant role in human bipedal evolution. But watching these elaborate courtship performances, the connection seems undeniable. You notice that Lucy's evaluation process extends beyond simple locomotor displays to include assessments of problem-solving ability and resource acquisition skills. Males who can demonstrate efficient tool use while maintaining upright postures score higher in her apparent ranking system than those who rely solely on physical displays. This suggests that sexual selection was operating on multiple traits simultaneously, favoring individuals who combined improved bipedalism with enhanced cognitive abilities. The reproductive advantages of efficient bipedalism become clear when you observe which individuals actually succeed in securing mates. Lucy shows preference for a male who walks upright with less obvious strain than his competitors, suggesting she is somehow able to assess the metabolic efficiency of different locomotor styles. This kind of sophisticated mate choice could rapidly select for biomechanical improvements in bipedal walking, even among individuals who would rather be climbing trees. Here is where the evolutionary implications become particularly intriguing. Lucy's mate preferences may have accidentally selected for the very traits that would eventually enable her descendants to become committed terrestrial travelers. By choosing partners who could walk efficiently, she was unknowingly contributing to genetic changes that would make future generations better adapted to ground-dwelling lifestyles. It is evolution by aesthetic preference, where choosing attractive partners accidentally improves species-level survival capabilities. The social dynamics during mating season reveal complex cooperation and competition patterns that extend beyond simple male-male rivalry. Females actively compare potential partners, sharing information about male performance through subtle social signals. This creates a kind of prehistoric peer review system, where mate choice decisions are influenced by group consensus rather than individual preference alone. Paleoanthropologists continue to argue about the sophistication of early hominin social structures, but Lucy's group demonstrates clear evidence of collaborative decision-making in reproductive contexts. You observe that successful reproduction requires not just attractive partners, but also access to high-quality territories that can support the elevated energy demands of pregnancy and child. Rearing. Lucy's mate choice is therefore influenced by male access to productive foraging areas and safe sleeping sites. This territorial component of sexual selection creates additional pressure for efficient locomotion, as males who can defend larger territories through superior mobility gain significant reproductive advantages. The seasonal nature of these reproductive displays reveals another layer of energy management strategy. During abundant periods, when food is readily available, both males and females invest heavily in courtship behaviors and mate evaluation. But during leaner times, these elaborate displays are dramatically reduced, with mating decisions apparently based more on immediate resource availability than on impressive locomotor performances. This seasonal flexibility suggests that Lucy's species had sophisticated understanding of when they could afford the luxury of choosy mate selection. As the mating season winds down and successful pairs begin establishing territories, you witness the immediate practical consequences of Lucy's mate choice decisions. Her selected partner demonstrates consistently superior bipedal locomotion during their joint foraging expeditions, suggesting that her evaluation process successfully identified individuals with genuine locomotor advantages rather than just impressive but unsustainable display abilities. This kind of accurate mate assessment could rapidly accelerate evolutionary improvements in bipedal efficiency, creating positive feedback loops between sexual selection and survival relevant traits. The reproductive success patterns emerging from this season's matings will ultimately determine which genetic combinations get passed on to future generations. And Lucy's choices are contributing to evolutionary changes that she couldn't possibly foresee. Her preference for efficient bipedal walkers is accidentally selecting for the biomechanical improvements that will eventually enable her distant descendants to abandon arboreal lifestyles entirely and become the planet's most successful terrestrial species. You are watching Lucy face the perfect storm of evolutionary pressures that would have broken a lesser species, and her response reveals the true genius of Australopithecus' survival strategy, doing just enough to get by while complaining about it the entire time. The challenges surrounding her are mounting like bills in your mailbox. Climate change is fragmenting her forest habitat. Geological activity is reshaping the landscape. Predators are evolving new hunting strategies, and her own species' increasing brain size is making every aspect of daily life more metabolically expensive. The convergence of these multiple stressors creates what evolutionary biologists call a selective bottleneck, where only the most adaptable individuals survive to reproduce. But Lucy's version of adaptability isn't the heroic flexibility celebrated in nature documentaries. It is more like the grudging accommodation of someone who keeps finding new items added to their already overwhelming to-do list. She adapts not through enthusiasm, but through sheer bloody-minded persistence in the face of increasingly ridiculous circumstances. The climate pressures alone would challenge any species. The ongoing aridification of East Africa is accelerating, creating longer dry seasons and more unpredictable rainfall patterns. Lucy's group must now factor weather variability into every decision about territory selection, migration timing, and resource allocation. You observe them developing increasingly sophisticated behavioral responses to climate uncertainty. But these adaptations come at enormous energy costs that further strain their already tight metabolic budgets. Simultaneously, the geological forces reshaping the Rift Valley continue their relentless work, creating new mountains, valleys, and river systems that fragment populations and alter local ecosystems. Lucy's mental map of safe territories and reliable resources requires constant updating as familiar landmarks disappear and new obstacles emerge. The cognitive load of tracking these environmental changes while maintaining basic survival functions would be overwhelming for most species. But Lucy's group manages it through what appears to be collective geographic memory and shared environmental knowledge. The predator landscape is evolving as well, with large cats adapting their hunting strategies to exploit the increasingly open habitats created by forest fragmentation. Saber-toothed cats are becoming more efficient at hunting in mixed woodland, grassland environments, while hyenas are developing pack tactics specifically designed to target vulnerable hominins during terrestrial travel. Lucy's group must constantly refine their anti-predator strategies, adding yet another layer of complexity to their daily survival calculations. Here is where the story becomes particularly compelling from an evolutionary perspective. Rather than being overwhelmed by these multiple pressures, Lucy's species appears to be developing integrated solutions that address several challenges simultaneously. Their improved bipedal efficiency helps with long-distance travel required by climate change, provides better predator detection capabilities, and reduces the metabolic costs of carrying increasingly large-brained infants. It is accidental multitasking on an evolutionary scale. The social pressures within Lucy's group are intensifying as well, with competition for mates, territories, and resources becoming more acute as environmental conditions deteriorate. But rather than fragmenting under this stress, the group is developing more sophisticated cooperation strategies. Resource sharing becomes more systematic, territorial defense more coordinated, and child rearing more communal. Scientists have debated whether cooperation or competition was the primary driver of early human social evolution. But Lucy's group demonstrates that both can intensify simultaneously under sufficient environmental pressure. You observe Lucy making increasingly complex trade, off decisions that would challenge a modern economist. Should the group risk crossing dangerous open terrain to reach a reliable water source, or should they remain in a safer but less resource-rich area? Should they invest energy in tool manufacture that might improve foraging efficiency, or should they conserve that energy for potential emergency travel? Every decision involves multiple variables and competing priorities, creating cognitive demands that push the limits of Lucy's enhanced but still modest brain capacity. The reproductive pressures are particularly intense, as the combination of increased environmental stress and higher metabolic costs reduces the number of offspring that can be successfully raised to maturity. Lucy's generation is essentially engaged in a demographic bottleneck, where only the most efficiently adapted individuals and the most cooperative groups will contribute genes to future populations. Paleoanthropologists continue to argue about population sizes and reproductive success rates among early hominins. But the evidence suggests Lucy's species was walking a demographic tightrope during this period of multiple environmental stresses. As you watch Lucy navigate this maze of evolutionary challenges, you realize you are witnessing one of the most crucial periods in human prehistory. The multiple pressures forcing her species toward more efficient bipedalism, enhanced cooperation, and improved cognitive abilities are accidentally creating the foundation for all future human success. But Lucy herself experiences none of this as triumphant progress. She is simply trying to survive in a world that keeps getting more complicated and demanding by the season. You are witnessing Lucy's group perfect what might be called the strategic energy conservation lifestyle, and it is a masterclass in evolutionary efficiency disguised as prehistoric procrastination. While popular science often portrays early hominins as energetic pioneers boldly exploring new environments, Lucy and her contemporaries have developed a survival philosophy that would make any modern couch potato proud. Why expend energy when you can conserve it? And why walk when you can sit? The daily routine you observe reveals sophisticated energy budgeting that rivals any modern fitness tracker. Lucy's group has mentally catalogued the caloric costs of every activity in their behavioral repertoire, from basic locomotion to social interaction, and they've organized their lives around minimizing unnecessary expenditure. They've discovered that sitting upright uses significantly less energy than standing, lying down uses less than sitting, and that the optimal position for most activities is whatever requires the least muscular effort to maintain. This laziness isn't random or undisciplined. It is a carefully calibrated response to the harsh realities of their metabolic situation. With their inefficient bipedal locomotion burning through limited energy reserves, every calorie conserved through strategic inactivity is a calorie available for essential survival functions like brain maintenance, immune system operation, and reproductive investment. You watch Lucy choose a comfortable position against a tree trunk for her afternoon rest, and her selection criteria clearly prioritize minimal energy expenditure over social status or environmental awareness. The group's approach to tool use exemplifies this energy conservation philosophy. Rather than investing effort in creating sophisticated implements that might improve their long-term efficiency, they consistently choose the simplest available solutions that require minimal initial investment. A naturally sharp stone is always preferable to one that requires modification. A straight stick beats one that needs straightening, and any tool that is too heavy to carry casually gets abandoned immediately after use. Here is where Lucy's laziness becomes evolutionarily brilliant. By avoiding unnecessary energy expenditure, her group is inadvertently creating selective pressure for more efficient physiological systems. Individuals who can accomplish the same survival tasks with lower metabolic costs will have more energy available for other crucial functions like reproduction and immune defense. Laziness isn't just a behavioral strategy. It is an evolutionary force that rewards efficiency and punishes waste. You observe the social dynamics of this energy conservation culture, and they're surprisingly sophisticated. Group members actively monitor each other's energy expenditure, discouraging unnecessary activity and encouraging rest whenever possible. This creates a supportive environment for metabolic conservation that extends beyond individual behavior to become a group survival strategy. Paleoanthropologists have debated whether early hominins had complex social support systems, but Lucy's group demonstrates clear evidence of collective energy management. The territory selection preferences of Lucy's group reflect this same conservation philosophy. They consistently choose home ranges that minimize travel requirements between essential resources, even when this means accepting lower quality food sources or less optimal sleeping sites. Distance becomes the enemy, and any territory that requires extensive walking between water, food, and shelter gets rejected in favor of more compact arrangements that support a sedentary lifestyle. The feeding strategies reveal another layer of this conservation approach. Lucy's group has developed remarkable tolerance for dietary monotony, apparently preferring to exhaust nearby food sources completely rather than expend energy traveling to more varied but distant alternatives. They'll consume every available fig in a local tree before considering a walk to the next grove, turning variety, seeking into a luxury they can't afford rather than a nutritional necessity. Their predator avoidance tactics follow the same energy conserving principles. Rather than maintaining constant vigilance through active patrolling or sentinel behavior, they rely heavily on passive strategies like choosing sleeping sites with natural defensive advantages and avoiding areas with high predation risk entirely. It is risk management through lifestyle choice rather than active defense, and the energy savings are substantial. As evening approaches and Lucy's group settles into their nighttime routine, you witness the culmination of their daily energy conservation efforts. They've managed to meet their basic survival needs while expending minimal energy on locomotion, foraging, or social activities. Their success isn't measured in ground covered or challenges conquered, but in calories conserved and energy available for the essential biological processes that keep them alive. This systematic laziness represents one of evolution's most underappreciated survival strategies. By perfecting the art of doing just enough to get by, while avoiding anything resembling overexertion, Lucy's group is accidentally creating the selective conditions that will eventually produce more efficient bipedal locomotion, improved tool, making abilities, and enhanced cognitive capabilities in their descendants. Sometimes evolutionary progress comes not from striving to do more, but from becoming exceptionally good at doing less. You are standing at what might be called Lucy's retirement community, a cluster of ancient baobab trees that have become the preferred gathering place for older members of her species. These massive trees, with their enormous hollow trunks and sprawling canopies, represent the ultimate expression of Lucy's energy conservation philosophy: maximum comfort with minimum effort required. The elderly Australopithecines who've claimed these trees as their territory have essentially created the prehistoric equivalent of a luxury-assisted living facility. The demographic composition of this baobab community tells a fascinating story about Australopithecine aging and social structure. You observe individuals who clearly represent multiple generations, from middle-aged adults like Lucy to genuinely elderly specimens whose graying fur and deliberate movements suggest they've survived far longer than the average lifespan for their species. These senior citizens have become the repositories of environmental knowledge, walking libraries of information about seasonal patterns, resource locations, and survival strategies. What is particularly remarkable is how these older individuals have refined the art of strategic laziness to levels that would impress any efficiency expert. They've identified the most comfortable positions in each tree, the optimal times for various activities based on temperature and sunlight patterns, and the minimal movement sequences required to access food, water, and social interaction. It is as if they've spent decades perfecting a lifestyle that maximizes comfort while minimizing energy expenditure. The knowledge transfer happening in this baobab community represents one of the earliest forms of what anthropologists might recognize as cultural transmission. Younger individuals like Lucy seek out these elderly advisors not for active teaching, but for passive observation of their highly refined survival techniques. The old-timers don't lecture or demonstrate, they simply live their optimized lifestyles, while others watch and learn. It is education by example, and the curriculum consists entirely of advanced techniques for doing less while achieving more. You notice that the territorial arrangements within the baobab community follow strict seniority hierarchies, with the most experienced individuals claiming the prime real estate within the hollow trunks, while younger visitors make do with external branch positions. This isn't arbitrary age-based discrimination. It is recognition that the oldest members of the group possess survival knowledge that is literally irreplaceable. Their preferred positions aren't just comfortable. They're the result of decades of experimentation in optimizing energy conservation. The tool-use patterns among these elderly Australopithecines reveal sophisticated understanding of leverage, efficiency, and minimal effort problem. Solving, they've had years to perfect techniques for accomplishing necessary tasks with the absolute minimum physical investment. A senior female demonstrates how to crack nuts using precisely calculated stone placement that requires only the slightest tap to achieve maximum shell breakage. It is tool use refined to an art form where every movement has been optimized through decades of practice. Here is where the evolutionary implications become profound. These baobab communities may represent the emergence of what researchers call cultural repositories, stable social units, dedicated to preserving and transmitting accumulated knowledge across generations. While mainstream paleoanthropology often focuses on the dramatic aspects of early hominin life, like hunting and migration, Lucy's retirement community suggests that much of their actual survival success depended on perfecting mundane activities through patient observation and gradual refinement. The social dynamics within this elderly community show interesting patterns of cooperation and mutual support that go beyond simple resource sharing. Individuals with different areas of expertise, weather prediction, predator behavior, seasonal plant cycles, form loose advisory partnerships that combine their knowledge. It is not formal instruction, but rather a kind of collaborative wisdom, sharing that emerges naturally from shared experience and mutual respect for accumulated expertise. You observe that Lucy herself is beginning to transition from active group member to knowledge-seeking visitor in these baobab communities. Her own movement patterns are becoming more deliberate and efficient, her rest periods longer and more strategically timed, and her attention increasingly focused on observing the techniques employed by more experienced individuals. She is essentially serving an apprenticeship in advanced energy conservation under the tutelage of masters who've spent lifetimes perfecting the art. The seasonal rhythms of the baobab community reveal another layer of sophisticated resource management. During abundant periods, these trees become gathering points for multiple family groups, creating temporary concentrations of knowledge and experience that benefit everyone involved. But during lean times, the communities contract to their core elderly members, who demonstrate remarkable ability to survive on minimal resources through their highly refined conservation techniques. As twilight approaches and the baobab community settles into its evening routine, you witness something that might represent one of the earliest examples of what anthropologists would recognize as institutional knowledge preservation. These elderly Australopithecines aren't just surviving. They're maintaining living libraries of environmental and behavioral information that enable their entire species to navigate an increasingly challenging world with greater efficiency and lower energy costs.